It's like Weekend at Bernie's, except this time Bernie fights back. Welcome to Southpaw Deep Space Nine. I'm your co-host, Angel Marti, and this is the show where every week I take your friend and mine, Southpaw Sam, on a journey into Star Trek fandom by watching every episode of the most communist Star Trek series, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and dissecting and analyzing each episode in terms of the different cultural and political messages, both overt and implicit. Sam, how are you doing today?
You know what? I have to mention something based on our normal intro about the most communist Star Trek, because I just saw on Twitter, and this might get a little bit dated for people listening, but at the time of this recording, I saw the Star Trek communist talk about how his interview.
Yeah, Will Nguyen.
Yes. How his interview from the Star Trek website about the communism of Star Trek has been taken down.
Yeah. The official StarTrek.com website has been pretty based for a while. Like they had article. I got to check if the article talking about if ACAB includes Odo is still posted. But yeah, they did an interview with Will Nguyen about how he uses his Star Trek fandom to basically agitate for Marxism, and it's been taken down. So justice for Will Nguyen, free my man.
I think it's more of a canary in the mine because there's a general ratcheting further and further onto the right, the further away we are from the George Floyd protests. I think the only reason you could get something like that up on the Star Trek website is because of all the advancement that was made because of all the Black Lives Matter protests and the George Floyd protests. But since then, we've been ratcheting further and further to the right during the pandemic. And now with war in Ukraine happening, I have to assume everybody is so right wing right now. Anything related to Marxism or the left is getting taken down.
Basically, because everybody still thinks, for some reason, most Americans still think Russia is communist. So basically, people can suppress any kind of pro-communist content under the guise of it being pro-Russian.
I think there's that. I think there's also just an added element of like, maybe we swung too far. We were getting too radical.
Oh, God, yeah.
And we need to come back towards, liberalism and American values and trying to paint America as like a shining example of freedom and all that is good and Pax Americana. So then to talk about communism or any type of socialism right now would imply then that there's something to critique about us. And they don't want any critique of the U.S. empire right now. So I think there's also that added element.
Capitalism's just like, no hate, only good vibes. I'm focusing on myself right now. I'm staying in my lane, moisturized, unbothered. No room for the haters.
I mean, I think even in general, a lot of ACAB, this criticism of cops is like not allowed right now. The winds have shifted so much where now even people who were critical, liberals, or maybe even some leftists who were critical of even the police are now rolling that back, and now they're not so critical of the police. Right now, if you start talking about ACAB or criticize the police, somebody's liable to call you a tanky or, get mad at you. So that's how much we have shifted further to the right, maybe even more so than we were prior to the protests. So we're living in a scary time right now. And regardless of what happens with the war in Ukraine, what I've said is white supremacy will win.
Well, speaking of like irritating liberal analyses on war, that takes us into today's episode. This is season 1, episode 12, Battle Lines. So we open on Sisko's office, where O'Brien and Dax are showing Sisko that they found some old Cardassian files from when the Cardassians had control of the station. And they have files on some Bajoran terrorists, including Major Kira. O'Brien warns that maybe you should let Kira know before she finds it herself. And then Kira comes in the office and basically says, what? Let me see. And then it cuts to ops, where Kira storms out of the office complaining that she's only listed as being a minor operative of the Bajoran resistance, which This reminded me of how I felt when I both discovered and then read my page on KeyWiki. I was like, come on, there's more to me than just the two articles that I've had, the article that I had published in Democratic Left. That's all you've got on me? Bashir comes in on the comms to let Cisco know that a Bajoran transport that he thought was only carrying medical supplies is also carrying Kai Opaka, who we met in the pilot. She's the Bajoran spiritual leader, and now she wants a tour of the station. And Cisco and Kira are way surprised that this is happening. It's just like imagine if you got like a shipment in of, I don't know, like imagine if like the truck that restocks all the chips at the 7-Eleven pulled in and just like the Dalai Lama was sitting in the back of the truck. So apparently the Kai's never really left Bajor before, let alone come to DS9. And when she arrives on the station, Bashir notices that she's preoccupied. And given that this is Bashir's first reaction to a woman arriving on Deep Space Nine, I'm guessing that the nun-like conservative garments are working because Dr. Horny's powers seem completely nullified. Or maybe it's just that Kai Opaka hasn't like threatened to kill him or shown any kind of visible annoyance at him, and that's what he needs to feel interest. So Opaka's found the antidote to Dr. Horny's miasma. So during Opaka's visit, she expresses a strong interest in going to see the wormhole, and she doesn't even ask directly. All she does is give Cisco this very sort of mischievous smile, and Cisco immediately schedules he requisitions a runabout to take her into the wormhole. And so one of the things that I noticed here, though, is that why the hell doesn't a visiting Bajoran spiritual leader get all of the dress uniform style pomp and circumstance that the freaking Wadi got and move along home? It's like after they know that she's here, they just are going along, not even dress uniforms. I mean, for a second, I thought it was maybe that like Kai Opaka wanted to go under the radar, but it's not like she's walking openly on the promenade, and it's not like all the Bajorans on the station wouldn't recognize her. So I like to think that maybe it's just after they were so disappointed that the Wadi showed no interest in it, Cisco was just like, all right, we're just not going to do that anymore.
If I didn't know what you and other fans had told me how big of a deal, how like as a spiritual leader Kai Opaka was,
yeah,
I wouldn't have been able to tell.
Right.
Because of the way that is so subdued and just seems like it's just another person, right?
Well, also we just don't get a lot of Opaka between like the pilot and this episode. So it's like not really, it's because it's been a while since we've last seen her. It is easy to just be like, all right, is this person like just another Bajoran refugee or whatever? But it's like, no, she's like, Kira's subsequent reaction to her makes it very clear, but it just does seem out of the blue. So when they're about to enter the runabout to go on this trip to the wormhole, Opaka sees O'Brien and says, you have a child, don't you? Because, O'Brien's very dad-shaped, so you don't have to be a spiritual leader to guess that, looking at Miles. But she then takes off her necklace and tells O'Brien to give it to his daughter. So that's like the first clue that like there's some bad premonitions going on here. But so they board the runabout, which is called the Yangtze Kiang, which it's Yangtze Jiang, damn it. But nobody cares but me. So they go into the wormhole and come out the other side. And Cisco remarks that it's the smoothest ride yet. And since we know in the pilot that the wormhole is inhabited by basically Kai Opaka's employers, it would make sense that they would make it smooth for them. Opaka just seems moved to tears by the experience, which the fact that like we don't see something happening that has great emotional effect on the characters sort of foreshadows some things that happen in the rest of this episode for me as far as the creative direction.
Are all the runabouts named after rivers on planet Earth?
Yes. Yeah, you caught up on that quick. They're like named like the Danube, the Orinoco. Yeah, that's just their little theme. It's cute. It doesn't have any like particular greater significance or explanation. It's just that was their That was their fun little thing. I mean, they usually seem to have this theme. They usually have this thing where, like, on Star Trek shows, the shuttlecraft or like whatever smaller craft, are associated with the show have like some kind of theme. Like on the original series, all the shuttlecraft were named after like historical astronomers like Galileo and Copernicus. So it's a cute little Easter egg here. So Sisko says to Opaka that she will soon see what the wormhole will be worth to Bajor, and she responds, "If that is to be my fate." So, all right. This is me rewatching the episode, not quite remembering what happened. So I'm just like, okay, all right. We're basically being told she is expecting to die. Cool.
My wife, she said, yeah, this is going to be it. She's not leaving this planet. I'm like, what? How did you get that? She's like, watch.
She gives away, I mean, number one, like I said, she gives away like just something that was like on her person to the nearest like dad that in her in her purview. I mean, in her within the sound of her voice. And then she's like talking about she's referring to any kind of instance of her having a future with like ominous prophecy. So when they're about to turn around and go back to Deep Space Nine, she's like, "What's the hurry? Why do we need to leave? Go back already?" And then she makes another vague reference to testing prophecy. And then sure enough, they receive a strange subspace signal. And Opaka insists that they go and investigate it right now with her in the shuttle. This is like the Pope showing up and then insisting you drive him to meet his weed guy. They trace the signal to a moon, a small moon with a network of satellites orbiting it, and a group of life forms all gathered on a 12-kilometer patch of the surface. Seems suspicious. Seems like our sensors have picked up inciting incident, Captain. So when they go in for a closer look, the satellites fire on them and disable their shields and thruster controls, so they are forced to crash land. And sure enough, Opaka is the only one who needs to be pulled out of the shuttle because she's fucking dead. Of all the lengths someone will go to just to be right, my God, just because she's told that she's gonna die by prophecy, she makes them go out of their way to drive all the way to some moon with murder satellites. But Kira is devastated. Like this is like if you were Italian, the Pope visited, asked you to go visit his weed dealer, and then you got caught in a hit and run and you survive. So Kira, unfortunately, is not allowed to mourn for long, and I wonder if mourn is allowed to Kira for very long, as they are met by a group of Mad Max rejects with weapons. We cut back to the station. Dax, O'Brien, and Odo are like nervous call center employees trying to figure out where Sisko and the Kai are because they've lost contact with them for hours, and what to tell the Bajorans about it because their spiritual leader has gone missing. Dax and O'Brien decide to follow them in their own runabout and have the Bajorans station a ship on the Gamma Quadrant side of the wormhole. We cut back to the moon. And Sisko, Dax, and Bashir are taken to the unwashed clan's equally unwashed leader, and we learn that they are called the Ennis. Garth Ennis? No, just the Ennis. And their leader is called Golan Shelah. He asks Sisko why they're there, asking if Sisko knows anything about their home planet or what the punishment is. We'll get to that later. But Kira interrupts the interrogation with cries of pain because she obviously has suffered some other kind of injury. I guess it's just like the amount of dead you got in that shuttle crash depended on how Bajoran you were. But Bashir asked to be allowed to treat her, and Shelah assents, so we know that these characters are somewhat sympathetic.
A note to our loyal listeners. If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor, by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, as well as our private chat group on Discord. Show your Southpaw solidarity, by supporting us, at patreon.com/southpawpod.
So Shelah tells Sisko that the Ennis are at war with a brutal enemy that attacks at whim and is apparently impervious to directed energy weapons. And then they reveal that they do not control the satellites orbiting the moon that shot the shuttle down. And in fact, those satellites are holding them prisoner. So the enemy that they're fighting against are called the Null Ennis. And so just because Ennis and Null Ennis seems too confusing to me, I'm just going to call Shell-Law's people the Garth Ennis. But so apparently the Null Ennis and the Garth Ennis were forced onto this moon with no resources and no doctors. And Bashir's a doctor. And so it's also lucky that they were banished to this moon without any doctors or any horny people. So his services are doubly needed. Kira, however, is still just sort of obsessing over Opaka's death and how she was this important spiritual symbol who then is just left to die on some unknown moon. Which, is kind of how I'm feeling. And I will get to my feelings on that as we get through the episode. So, Shella offers to protect them from the Null Ennis in exchange for Dr. Bashir's help. And then he offers to train the Ennis in the basics of field triage. Thankfully not in the skill of doctor-patient boundaries. So the Null Ennis attack. During the firefight, all the Ennis are apparently shot dead. Like, everybody dies. Kira grabs a phaser and stops the attack by shooting some rocks that cause a little avalanche that drive the attackers away. So as our heroes assess the casualties, they hear a voice and a figure coming out of the shadows, and it's Kai Opaka. Bashir scans her, and it seems to be her. It's not a clone. It's not some kind of make me live, conscience transference. She's alive. She's normal. However, Bashir does take Sisko aside and tell him in confidence that there seems to be, quote, a biomechanical presence at a cellular level. Has she been put into a Ghost in the Shell cyber body? Is she the Laughing Man? What more nerdy references can I fit into this episode? Bashir suggests that he could get a better understanding of the nature of her resurrection if the Runabout's computer was online. And too bad the computer is also dead, so they have to fix that. But then we see everybody who was shot dead during the attack come back to life. They basically just shrug off being shot and stabbed, and they're like, ugh, and then they wake back up. Great, our heroes have crash landed into the thriller video. So, we cut back to Dax and O'Brien on the shuttlecraft, and then the Dax and O'Brien are able to find the runabouts, blah, 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 tech, particle signal, and they set a course for the A-plot. So Bashir scans all of these miraculously resurrected people and finds that the biomechanical presence inside Opaka is inside all of them. Clearly, the biomechanical presence is the friends we made along the way. But it turns out they explain that they have died and come back to life a bunch of times during the course that they've been on this moon. So now fixing the Runabout's computer to try and figure this shit out becomes Bashir's priority. It also becomes Shell-Law's priority because he wants to know why the hell he keeps dying and coming back. And he agrees to provide protection to Bashir as they go back to the Runabout. So we get more explanation from Shell-Law, some more exposition. This episode's a real exercise in telling and not showing, because Shell-Law explains that the Ennis and Null Ennis were basically like space Hatfields and McCoys. They're clans that have been in a never-ending generational feud, and the leaders of their home planet were unable to mediate a peace, so they just banished them to this moon where they could fight and kill each other over and over again to, quote, serve as an example for the rest of civilization. And so this is where I start to think about all the things that make me feel irritated about this episode, because it sort of reminds me of old liberal attitudes that I used to have before my radicalization, because thinking about these two people who are caught in a perpetual war, and they're just because they couldn't negotiate, outside parties couldn't negotiate peace, they just banished them both. This really makes me feel like what white liberals wish they could do to the entire Middle East. Because I just remember when I was, just sort of parroting, what what my parents and like, The Daily Show and other, liberal sort of political, sort of semi-political outlets would say about the Middle East. It just does feel like the prevailing attitude was just like, these two backwards people are just fighting forever and nobody can get them to agree. I just wish we could just sort of, remove them from the entire equation. So this is what starts to make me feel like this whole episode is just liberal aspirational fiction. But especially when Cisco asked Shelah, like, what did the conflict start over? And Shelah was just like, some say it was land, some say it was water. It's now been forgotten, and the only motivation now is vengeance. Like, it's just amazing how it just really echoes how, you ask like most people to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they'll just talk about how it's like, oh, it's just, conflict that goes thousands and thousands of years back to biblical times. And like, they'll just like not talk about how like the actual like mandate of Palestine and the creation of the state of Israel in like 1947 being imposed on the Middle East by Britain and Western and European powers has nothing to do with it. Like, and like and not that there continue to be actual modern actions taken to escalate the violence. They always just like to say it as just like, oh, they're just fighting to fight.
There's a good parallel we could draw here with the Bajorans. There's a later scene where even Kira talks about that Bajorans, even if you can die, right, they'll still fight. And they didn't make this explicit. I think they had too much of a liberal bias, but just based on the context, how I can use the Bajorans as an example to the point you're making is that in this scenario, if you can't die, there's no consequences. So fighting isn't that big of a deal, right? And so then they just kind of make it about like these ideas that are just silly and you're just choosing to fight. But if you can die like Bajorans, and to your point, like Palestinians, then you need material reasons to fight. Bajorans don't fight just to fight. There's a material reason to risk your life. And so they draw a parallel where they're saying Bajorans are just like these people, but in actuality, they're not, because these people have nothing at stake. And so then it just really is about a feud in their minds. But for the Bajorans, they fought not because of ideas, but because of the material consequences of their life, which forced them to fight, because otherwise they were going to constantly be killed anyway. So this goes back to a point you always like to bring up, dialectical materialism. This is the difference to maybe how you used to think, which was in this more of like, the world is made up of ideas and people can just choose to be better, versus the Marxist way of thinking about things, which is that the world is based around material reality and we're all acting on it and we're all products of our environment. And if people fight, it's because there's a reason, there's something happening, there's some material reason that is causing them to fight and be willing to risk their life for something.
Yeah, and on that point, so Kira starts like, instead of moralizing about, both sides stuff, she just starts telling Shelah about the flaws in their tactics. And then Shelah just goes, when you cease to fear death, the rules of war change. Which, like, to me, actually, I just thought of this now. The whole, like, them just sort of killing each other and getting to just sort of regenerate and kill each other over and over again is kind of a metaphor for the fact that, like, especially, when people in the imperial core hear about, all the conflicts in the Middle East, because they're so far away and we don't like have any kind of personal sense of like the actual death and suffering, it is easy to just sort of conceive of like, at this time in particular, I guess, like Israelis and Palestinians is just like a group of people that just are sort of constantly killing each other and then just like constantly regenerating to kill each other again. So Opaka like tells Kira, that she probably, that Kira must see herself in these people, but then warns Kira that this is not her war, which almost seems to put Kira instead in the role of like Americans, sort of like, because the liberal view, I think, of the Middle East is like, oh, we shouldn't get involved. We still shouldn't get involved because it's not our war and we shouldn't be the police of the world. But like, we still view like both parties as just sort of these backwards people caught in a cycle of death, rather than, having any kind of role in the conditions that created this cycle of death.
Yeah, it reduces historical materialism into something very silly, which is what liberals like to do.
Yeah. So Cisco then decides to give an offer to Shelah, which is that when the rescue party that is inevitably going to come and penetrate the defense satellite network holding them prisoner, they will offer to transport both the Garth Ennis and Noel Ennis off of this planet so they can escape the Sisyphean punishment. So the condition, though, is that the Shelah has to get the leader of the Noel Ennis, Zlanko, a name almost as fun to say as Ibudan, to agree to a ceasefire. There's this great line where like Shelah almost goes full Stallone. He's just like, "You'll never agree to a ceasefire." He says the Noel would never agree to it, but Cisco manages to convince him that if he really cares about escaping this fucking torture, he will at least agree to talk. So then we cut back to this runabout, and Dax and O'Brien are finding the right star system, and then there's some... This scene is so full of like very next generationist technobabble bullshit that serves no purpose other than to explain why it's taking them so long to find Cisco and the gang. Like, do we really need a scene telling us this? Like, we can understand that it's taking them a while to find them by them just not showing up yet. We don't need to explain why it takes them a while to I don't know. Again, this might have just been because I was grumpy when I was watching it, but like, there's a scene where so like O'Brien like says like we can find the runabout if like we outfit the probes with a differential magnetomer, and Dax goes, "I've never heard of a differential magnetomer. How does it work?" And I literally shouted, "Who cares?" at the screen.
I think that was all attempts of using nerdy talk as humor.
As filler, though, it's fucking packing peanuts.
You're basically talking shit about Big Bang Theory then, too.
Oh, I hate Big Bang Theory. So back on the moon, where the actual fucking narrative is happening, we cut back to the runabout, and all we see is the runabout's computer turning on and Bashir saying, "Nice work, Julian." Oh, come on. No monologue about how you had to reconfigure the Magnus capacitor manifold and reverse the polarity on the boson flux hygrometer. Come on, DS9 writers. My rectum is prolapsing from how badly I need to hear a fake technological explanation for why the plot is happening.
I was waiting for them to say the flux capacitor.
I know. You could just replace every like noun with flux capacitor in those kinds of technobabble like monologues, and it doesn't change anything. But then also, okay, then we cut to Shelah returning to talk to Cisco, saying that Zlenko has agreed off screen to the ceasefire. What the fuck? I'm so angry that this episode had to deal with we had to see a fucking 2-minute scene of Dax and O'Brien talking about magnetic fields like Bill Nye on a Robitussin trip, instead of actually seeing some character interaction that would have actually informed more of the emotional stakes of the plot. Like, God damn it. Like, Star Trek, I'm so angry because I love you. Like, I know you're better than this. I'm mad and disappointed.
If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
So, Shelah says he and Zlanko have agreed to meet at a neutral location near the runabout. So when Kira voices concerns that there might be a trap, Shelah just responds that they've taken the appropriate precautions, which means, yeah, they're just going to fucking not kill each other as soon as they get there, huh? Sisko goes off with Shala, and we get Kira and Opaka by themselves, where Opaka asks Kira if she sees herself in these people. And we get this scene where Kira talks about how, like, you know, she's really longs for spiritual absolution and forgiveness from Opaka herself and from the prophets, because, you know, she's guilty about all the violence she's done in her life, and you know, she doesn't want to create the impression that she enjoys fighting just because, you know, she's so, you know, material minded, about fighting, and so focused on just tactics. And she's moved past that stage in her life, and Opaka says that she can only move forward if she accepts the violence inside her instead of denying it. Like, as much as I might hate the actual politics of the subtext of the episode, the interaction between the actors during this scene, like as the filming of it, at least humanizes enough that I can see that it's really just about, you know, the trauma of growing up under constant warfare, and how it, you know, Kira doesn't want to feel like, you know, her psyche has not been permanently warped to being a violent person, and that even committing justified violence can make you still feel guilty.
This was also the first scene where I saw DS9 address Kira's PTSD, that all the war and her past had traumatized her, and it was acknowledging that.
Right. Yeah. And it's not the last time. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, like, this is one of the things where in this episode, it's like, this theme is interesting. Why don't we focus more on this instead of freaking magnetic fields? I'm going to let that go. I'm going to let that go. I also just, like, my initial, like, sort of uncharitable reading of the scene also made me sort of give myself a little bit of a reality check, because, like, the same way that, like, I was saying how liberals can just sort of view conflicts in the Middle East as just like groups of people who just like keep killing each other over and over again, you know, without actually suffering, without imagining the suffering of actually dealing with death. It can be easy for like communists who grow up in the safe imperial core like myself to fetishize justified violence without thinking about the long-term psychological effects and how it can still suck to be, you know, embroiled in violence, even if it's for a good cause. So I did some self-reflection, you know, thanks to this scene.
I think another way to read this isn't just about war and shitty liberal politics about it, but also this episode for me felt like an allegory for purgatory. It felt like very much a metaphorical episode, which also makes sense then why Kai Opaka is here, right? If you are in purgatory, then you need the spiritual leader.
Sam, if this episode had been executed the way that you just pitched it, like if this was like, if Kai Opaka was was Virgil and Kira was Dante, and this is like Dante's Inferno, where like, you know, Kira's just sort of exposed to this thing as sort of like a metaphor for her own spiritual suffering, that would have been, you know, amazing. Like I'm doing, you can't see this because it's an audio podcast, but I'm doing the chef's kiss hands, the mwah, you know, like that would have been wonderful, but it really does not come off like this.
That's because all of that happened off screen. You just have to assume.
Yes, Jesus. So the Ennis and the Nolannis show up to meet near the runabout at a place where there's some conveniently lit tiki torches, and I guess that makes it feel more like a party than a peace talk. Sisko tells Bashir about the plan to transport them off the planet, and Bashir asks if that's like assisting a jailbreak, and Sisko very firmly tells them to fuck off because they've literally died over and over again in penance for whatever crimes they've committed. And Sisko just doesn't even want to entertain the debate if like this whole situation is morally or ethically justifiable, which I really dig about that. So I get that scene did make me think that, like, you know, even with a possible analog to liberal ideas of what conflicts in the Middle East are about, this might be like another. This could be construed as mostly an anti-capital punishment episode, as the real villain here is whoever sent these poor fucks onto this prison planet in the first place. And, that trapping somebody in a never-ending, cycle of violence, for the sake of punishment does kind of like eventually just decontextualize the suffering. It's just like when a punishment is just violence for violence, you could say that like when there's no like nothing that really, grounds the punishment in like the source of the transgression, there is no opportunity for transformation, then just like nothing really gets learned. But to me, the fact that the conflict, just again from a narrative creative point of view, the fact that the conflict between the Ennis and the Null Ennis existed prior to the imprisonment and wasn't just a result of the crabs in a bucket condition of their situation is what makes it feel still like they're just trying to do the liberal both sides crap. And the fact that Sisko kind of feels a little self-congratulatory about getting both sides to, come to talk. It makes me think that this episode wants you to think of Sisko as like what America's role was in the Camp David talks is. Like, for a historical note, for anybody who doesn't know, it does bear noting that, so this episode did air in April 1993, and in August of the same year was when the PLO and Israel signed the first Oslo Accord, which was like the beginning of a process that was supposed to eventually lead to some kind of two-state solution. I wonder how that turned out. But I just bring that up to say that like it is it is valid to assume that this was meant as like some kind of allegory for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because I'm sure it was in the news at the time.
Very much like the zeitgeist of the time.
Yeah. So of course, like we predicted, the talks break down. The Ennis and the Null Ennis all kill each other. Bashir tackles Sisko, possibly because he hasn't gotten any this whole episode and has to vent his urges somehow, but also conveniently saves Sisko from getting an axe in the back in the process. Bashir tells Sisko that he's been able to find out that, now that the runabout's computer is working, he's find out that once the cellular MacGuffins revive someone from death, the bodies cannot live without them at all after that point. And if anyone's taken off the planet, the microguffins stop working. So it's kind of like those locks that make a shopping cart's wheels seize up if you take them out of the supermarket parking lot, but at a cellular level.
God damn, I hate those.
Yeah. So conveniently, they can't transport the Ennis, Null Ennis, or Kaiopok off the planet without killing them. And so, like, that means they don't have to actually help anyone or change the status quo. Bashir says that he can, like, reprogram the nanobots to, like, eventually let them die. And then Opaka decides that it's her prophesied fate to, like, stay and help them heal before they die or some bullshit. Like, basically, they don't actually have to do anything, and they can just, like, leave and, like, feel bad about themselves while they leave, which is, like, ultimately the confirmation that this episode is about America in the Middle East.
This isn't even to defend or criticize this particular scene. It's just more about the context of how I'm watching it right now with everything that's happening in the world right now. So how I was reading it when it happened was how Golan Shalah is saying, program the bots then so we could all die, because that way then nobody wins, right? It's basically the nuclear option. He'd rather they all die than allow the Null Ennis to win, basically, right? And this hit too close to home because right now we have nuclear war currently on the table. And I'm seeing way too many liberals and even progressives to leftists joining in on the let's all die, it's worth it bandwagon. And what's funny is liberal Sisko fans who probably fancy themselves as being like Sisko probably see no contradictions in their actions with demanding NATO shoot down Russian planes or straight up nuke Russia first or try and assassinate Putin with no concern of reprisal. So they fancy themselves like Sisko, but they're acting like Golan Shalah. Let's just all die because it's better the world end than Putin win or whatever the hell. So there was that reading that didn't exist back then, but very much exists right now.
Yeah, exactly. The reaction to this situation is like, oh, it's a conflict that has like, causes that everybody like doesn't even remember now, and ultimately it's a conflict that doesn't affect us. So it would just alleviate our guilt and suffering of having to witness this conflict if everybody would just died and like made us stop having to care.
Except right now, it would be all of us die, right? It wouldn't be just Ukraine and Russia die. Like nuclear war would mean all of us die. And if I didn't explain it earlier, Cisco in this scene is the one who's like, no, we're not doing that.
Well, so that's the end of the episode, and if it wasn't obvious, I fucking hate this episode. Like, and I hope everybody who's like been listening to every episode of this podcast so far at least finds it a refreshing change, that like everybody knows that obviously I'm in no rush to shit on Deep Space Nine because I love this show and I love Star Trek, but this episode just like I would take like Move Along Home 1,000 times over this episode, because at least Move Along Home is an episode where like every scene like seems useful to explain, either advancing the plot or like developing the characters, and it's like everything interesting. Number one, it's like the premise of this episode feels like a TOS episode that didn't even have like TOS's fun campiness. Like the right version of this episode was basically like I mean, there have been multiple TOS episodes where it's like people are trapped on a planet and forced to fight to the death. There's Arena, where Kirk fights the Gorn. There's the Savage Curtain, where Kirk and Spock are forced to team up with Abraham Lincoln and Sirach to fight to the death with a team of villains from history. It's like there's something so like it's just that the premise is simplistic, and then the what they do with the premise is simplistic and ham-fisted. It feels like Opaka's involvement seems completely unnecessary and seems like just a completely just a arbitrary way to write the spiritual leader of the Bajorans out of the show. So I went and looked at the trivia section of the page of this episode on Memory Alpha, and it says that this was one of the costlier episodes of this season to produce, but like
that's surprising.
This episode only has like 3 sets. Like it has like Ops, the Runabout, and the planet, and it's just like it feels like an episode that was made as a filler, and it was like hamstrung by no budget.
So for listeners, you've heard Angel's critique of this episode, all very valid. I think especially the points about structure and writing and craft, how to craft a good show, how to craft good writing, directing, not just for Star Trek, but just in general, right? You want to show, not tell. But for me, coming into the show, my, I guess, job is to more think about the political readings of Star Trek. So when I watch it, I don't really pay too much attention to the craft of the show, which I normally do for other shows. But for this one, I'm thinking more from like the perspective of philosophy and politics and what are like the nuggets of ideas that they have. And so for me, some of the interesting ideas that I saw portrayed, starting with Kira and with the Ennis and Noel Ennis, that you can't just get over trauma by just deciding to get over it. You need to heal and process. They didn't really show us that. They literally just told you that you need to heal and process. So the execution was not so great, but that idea was there. And Kai Opaka had a good therapy session with Kira, and now is here to give the colony healing from their trauma. So it definitely made me think also if some of the writers are in themselves in therapy and maybe benefit from therapy. And they're like, let me write that in, kind of like have an episode about the benefits of therapy. Because the overall good message I got from this is that you need to work through your shit. Otherwise, the battle inside you will never end. So normally the war analogies in DS9 are literally about wars. But this one, I think very much is about the zeitgeist of the time of the conflicts that was happening in the 90s. But also I saw it as a metaphor for your own personal trauma, battles, and healing. And if you don't work through it, you'll be a prisoner of your own mind and of your own past, which we see on that moon where these people have a past together and they just can't get over it, work through their trauma. It's almost like Kai Opaka is there as some kind of like mediator, marriage counselor. So I kind of saw this also then as a self-care episode. We all need to work through our own battle lines, but also let's not press the literal nuclear option. Be a Cisco and not a Golan Shalah. I mean, I'm thinking about this like literally right now with constant talks about like nuclear bombs and, oh, Putin doesn't really mean at this time. And it's like, dude, that's something you don't want to be wrong about. And really, everybody's been wrong. All the experts have been wrong. Let's start from the '09 financial crisis. They were wrong. And then these same experts were wrong about Trump. And then these same experts were wrong about Putin invading. And now they're saying Putin doesn't really mean it with the nukes. He's just joking. Like, that's not something you want to be wrong about. Okay.
Well, you know what? Next week, I'm excited because the next episode is going to be, it's a bit of an O'Brien centric episode, which always makes it more delightful. It's going to be the storyteller. In the meantime, if you like this show, please make sure to follow us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/southpawpod. And for as little as $4 a month, you can become a Patreon patron and you can get access to our Discord server and participate in our lovely little community. And becoming a patron supports not just this show, but just Southpaw Prime. That's just my name for it. Fight Study, Pride Never Die, Working Stiff Radio, just helping this lovely little community of people who have come together over their love of leftism and various fighting sports and performing arts, just keeping it going. Sam, do you have any other things you want to plug before we sign off?
Let's just hope that the planet still exists for next week for us to watch that episode, because that episode sounds delightful and I'd like to be here to watch it.